Hi, this is Jeff with FrostyGarden.com, and today we're going to be talking about how we prepare our raised beds. Our raised beds are incredibly important to us as northern growers because they get us into warmer soils and up off the ground. Our crafted soils are also very nutritious, and so they allow us to grow very intensively and get a lot of food from a very small space. So today we're going to show you what we do in the early season and how we prepare them for growing all year. We start our preparations by clearing out all of our previous season's plants. We allow the winter kill to kill off all of our plants because it's much easier to remove plants that are already dead than it is those plants that are still alive. So we do clear out our plants in the early season. We remove any weeds that have developed and all of the old stems and leaves and any straw that might be left over, and we bring that out to our compost pile so that we can compost it over the next few months. We don't practice any kind of tilling techniques in our raised beds, and mostly that's because it's not very practical. It's such a small space that getting a tiller in there isn't very easy. But while we are clearing out our plants, oftentimes we will disrupt the top 4 to 5 inches of the soil. We have about 12 total inches of soil, and we try not to go any deeper than about 4 to 5 inches. And what that allows us to do is have a nice quality soil underneath where the mycorrhiza live, and basically we're not disrupting those very important soil structures, but we will generally aerate and try to till mostly with our hands or sometimes a tool those top 4 to 5 inches. Our general nutrition strategy for our raised beds is almost entirely based in organic gardening. We start with good old-fashioned compost. It's a great ingredient to add into your soils. For our 40 square foot beds, we'll use about 3 to 4 cubic feet of new compost that we add into the beds every single year. For our 20 square foot beds, we'll use about 2 cubic feet of new compost that we add into the beds. Beyond that, we also add a fertilizer. So we like to use Down to Earth's BioLive. It's a great fertilizer, it's long-term release, and it's very gentle on your plants, and the other thing that we like about it is that it contains mycorrhiza, so it's really good for your soil health in the long term. Another thing that a lot of gardeners don't pay attention to, they mostly focus on the NPK, or nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, but another important thing to focus on are trace minerals. So trace minerals are some of those lesser used components that plants do actively use, but are used in smaller and smaller quantities. And how we handle that problem is we use an ingredient called azomite. So azomite is a wonderful ingredient because it contains a lot of those different trace minerals and is just a generally good all-around trace mineral supplement that you can add into your soil. Some years we'll use an ingredient called green sand. So green sand is also focused on trace minerals, but what's great about green sand is that it increases the moisture retention of your soil. So if you're having any issues with water just draining through your soil very quickly, you might consider trying to add some green sand into your soil because it will help with that water retention. So once we've added our compost and our fertilizers into our soils, what we need to do is mix them into the soils. So we try to get a good mix. Sometimes we use a rake, sometimes we'll mix it in by hand, but basically what we're trying to do is spread out the fertilizer and spread out the compost so that we get a nice even application across our entire raised beds. Oftentimes we'll also use a rake to kind of level the beds out and level that soil so that we have a nice planting foundation for our beds in the coming season. For our perennial strawberry bed, and in fact almost all of our perennial plants, we do things a little bit differently. So perennials, what we do is we only add compost, and we'll lightly add a light layer of compost to the very top of the soil, and that's all we do. We don't really need to add any kind of fertilizers or trace minerals. And the reason that is the case is that we allow our perennials, all the greens, to basically die off in the winter, and we leave them in the soil, and that eventually breaks down and composts and turns into NPK that the plants use. Plus, a lot of perennials aren't very hungry, and so they don't need fertilizer in very high quantities. If we do notice any kind of deficiencies later in the season when they are growing, we might add fertilizer if we start to see spots or maybe yellowing or maybe have some other problem that we need to deal with. But for the most part, we treat our perennials with compost only. We don't really need to work the compost into the soil for our perennial beds. We just do a light layer across the top. And over time, what'll happen is the rainfall and our watering techniques will bring that fertilization into the soil itself and make it available for the plants. So it's a much easier process, and generally, if we have large perennials like such as our rhubarb, we might just bring the compost around the plant itself. We don't put it all over the bed where the plants aren't actually growing. It really needs to go into the roots, so if you have large perennials, you really only need to focus your compost additions into a very small area. Once we get all the compost and fertilizer worked into all of our soil, we basically set up our irrigation systems next. So we use pressure compensating emitters with emitters every 6 inches across our beds. And these lines are basically placed across the bed every 1 foot. So we have an emitter every 6 inches in every direction across the bed. This has been a really good irrigation technique, and it's tied into our rainwater catchment systems and our water storage techniques here on our homestead. This particular product comes from a company called DripWorks, and they don't sponsor us or anything, but we do like their products. They make excellent irrigation materials, and we use them quite heavily across all of our irrigation systems across our homestead. You might have noticed the hoops that we have over our bed, and a logical person might think that this is something that we're using for our cold climate and basically how we're making warmer than ambient air temperatures. That's actually not true. These are for bug protection. So we use these hoops for basically protecting against onion flies and other root maggots that can infest particular crops that we grow in our raised beds. Specifically, we're interested in protecting our allium crop, or our onions and garlic and leeks and things like that, and also our carrots, because they are highly susceptible to root maggots that can infest and destroy your plants. About 4 years ago now, we experienced a really bad onion fly infestation, and we've since recovered from it, but these hoops are very integral to our protection plans. And so every year, we don't mess around. We move these hoops from bed to bed, and we basically have all of our beds outfitted with the ability to have these hoops so that we can rotate our crops in between beds each year. How our hoops are built is we have a 1-inch piece of PVC pipe that is basically anchored to the bed itself using a 1-inch EMT clamp, and this is stuff you can find generally at the hardware store. And then our hoops themselves are made out of 1/2-inch PVC pieces. 1/2-inch PVC bends extremely easily, and we created ours to be rather high hoops, or what would be called a high hoop configuration. And the reason that we did that is because we grow rather tall plants in these raised beds. Onions can get to 2 or 3 feet tall sometimes, and so basically we need a lot of height in our beds to be able to handle that kind of height. So we chose to architect high hoops, and then when we actually have plants in here, we'll cover the hoops with a bug netting. And this protects our plants from all kinds of bugs, but mostly what we're interested in protecting against is root maggots, because they're a serious problem up here. Even in the north, even 50 below is not cold enough to kill those things. So another thing that we have to do is move our trellis every year. So we have 2 of our beds that are set up to accept a trellis, and this trellis is made out of 3/4-inch electrical conduit with elbows that create a frame. We then use fencing material and zip tie that fencing material to the actual frame, and then we use 3/4-inch conduit clamps that are attached to the actual raised bed in order to secure the trellis to the raised bed. We have this same kind of setup on 2 of our beds, and basically what that allows us to do is move the trellis from bed to bed to deal with crop rotation plans every year. One of the last things that we end up having to do is some general repairs to our garden. Our harsh subarctic winters are extremely difficult on any building materials that we might put out there. In some years, our fences are destroyed, our gate is destroyed, our trellis is destroyed. When we get between 5 and 10 feet of snow and ice over the winter, it's really difficult for anything that we would build to survive. And basically, this year we had basically a hole in our fence that we had to staple back up to prevent rabbits from getting into our garden. Fortunately, it was a really easy repair this year, and that was about all we had to do. So a little bit of straightening up, but other than that, just that fence repair. Once again, I'm Jeff with FrostyGarden.com, and I want to thank you for watching. We're a small channel with a small potential audience, and likes and subscribes really help us. If you think we've earned it, we would love it if you gave us a like and subscribe. We're really excited about getting these plants that we've been growing here, all from seed, into the ground, and that time is coming soon. We're maybe about a week out to get started on that process, and we look forward to taking you along for that ride. So, once again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.